All right. I just needed that deep breath for myself. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Keijman. On behalf of the Open Foundation, it is a real great pleasure to welcome you all, and of course to welcome our two speakers here. We're going to have a beautiful conversation. At least that's my expectation and hope. Um, if I'm not mistaken, over 140 people have signed up for this one, and this makes this one of the most popular panels that we have organized so far. And I think, and perhaps I kind of hope, that is due to the sort of special interest, pun intended, in this topic that many of you that you might have. And the topics of today, autism, psychedelics, and the non-ordinary experiences that they can engender, I think have some salient similarities. They have long been misunderstood by the majority of the population, including some mental health care professionals. I think they have been pathologized, and also since the 90s, many cultural narratives about them have become more and more nuanced, and we see a little bit of a sort of a healthier way of understanding these both these substances and neurodivergence at large. And as we realize today that psychedelic experiences can be profoundly wholesome and healing, there also seems to be a much more recognition of some of the unique gifts that many autistic people bring, which, and this is really important to note here, given all the harmful stereotypes of the savant, for example, in mind, it's not just because of their autism, and it's definitely not despite of their autism. And like the understanding that set and setting play quite a crucial role in influencing the outcome of a psychedelic journey, we might also better understand how society, the sort of cultural setting, and what we actually believe about autism, the sort of cultural set, if you will. Yeah, um, um, we might these cultural settings and sets also kind of shape the life of a lot of autistic folks these days. And so it's kind of my hope that today's conversation can not only explore what psychedelics can do for autistic folks, but also to what those working with psychedelics should know about autism in specific and neurodivergence in general. I'll immediately note that there are significant limitations and some significant problems with some of these very loose comparisons between autism and psychedelics that I just offered. I also really want to be aware of some of my own lingering autistophobia, which is a term that Nick, you have coined, or that I've at the very least I found in your work. And this is all despite my own sort of neurodivergence. And so to get us started in a moment, Nick and Alicia will offer some very fruitful concepts that can bring some clarity to this conversation, elucidating what we actually mean when we say autism or neurodivergent or neurodiversity. And especially if you are unfamiliar with the neurodiversity paradigm, we really want to invite you to listen with a very compassionate and curious ear, as what we share might really challenge some of the assumptions you might have or some of the ideas you have around autism in specific and neurodivergence in general. So with all of that being said, and thank you for your patience as we navigated some technical challenges, it is a great pleasure to introduce today's two guests. Nick Walker is a professor of psychology at the Californian Institute of Integral Studies, where he has been one of the principal architects of the new Bachelor's of Science degree program in psychedelic studies, which will be launching later this year, if I'm not mistaken. Dr. Walker has been a leading thinker on neurodiversity for more than 2 decades and is the author of the influential essay collection Neuroqueer Heresies. And Alicia Danforth holds a doctorate in clinical psychology and maintains a dual career as a clinical psychologist and a clinical trial researcher. And her private practice is tailored to the needs and preferences of autistic clients. And she was an investigator for the first study of MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety in autistic adults, where I think Nick and Alicia, you met each other. And she's currently on the leadership team of a multi-site pragmatic trial of psilocybin therapy in palliative care. And I already alluded to it. We were kind of like preparing for this conversation. We talked about your collaboration as yeah, to researchers, and perhaps it would actually be nice to kind of start here. Alicia, I mean, you alluded to this in the conversation as well, that your meeting has actually provoked you to really start to engage this concept, if you will, or of autism, and maybe you can start us off there.
Sure. Um, I've shared this story before because it was a real turning point in my career, but the story of how I met Nick and why that initial meeting was so fateful is kind of sweet for me, so I'll go ahead and share it. A mutual acquaintance approached me and said, "Hey, would you be willing to talk about the research you're doing for your dissertation at a salon we're doing in the city about psychedelics and neurodiversity?" And I said, "Sure." And I did not know Nick at the time, and the suggestion came up, "Why don't the two of you meet for lunch?" So at Nick's favorite Thai restaurant uh, in Berkeley over lunch, I was trying to make a good impression and put my best foot forward. And I was talking about the research that I was beginning and talking to um, my words, people with high functioning autism. And so gracefully and in a non-shaming way, Nick stopped me in my tracks and said, we knew nothing about each other's neurotypes at this initial meeting, by the way. Nick just gently stopped me and said, I'm going to stop you right there. That term you just used, I know you're making an effort to say the right things the right way, but I have a question about that term. And then very deliberately paused and locked my gaze and said, high functioning relative to what? And that was the paradigm shift. It was like that kind of screeching brakes sound effect. And that's what opened me to really considering how we think and speak about autism and what I was really trying to do with my research. And Nick's candor, Nick's willingness to teach me and inform me new understandings of neurodiversity really helped me not put a foot wrong from the outset in beginning to bring autistic individuals into psychedelic research. Our salon, our talk went very smoothly, it went wonderfully, and another real benefit from that initial meeting was it allowed me to bring Nick onto our research team to make sure that we weren't inadvertently harming our research participants or putting dangerous messages out there when we were reporting on our findings. So that lunch was the start of a fateful collaboration that here we are, continues to this day. So I knew I was listening to someone who knew what they were talking about when they started mentoring me and how to speak about neurodiversity. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Alicia. And yeah, this notion of how we can speak about, how we can think through neurodiversity in general, and also the sort of like notion of neurodivergence, right? Diverging from what, I think, is the core question. Nick, I've been deeply inspired by your work, especially in my own sort of like understanding of myself, but also the people around me who turned out to be almost all pretty neurodivergent. It's been really helpful to kind of like understand a couple of core concepts, and I want to invite you. Maybe you can help us understand what is meant by neurodiversity, and why is neurodiversity not the same as neurodivergence, or why would you argue that someone that is autistic should not say I'm neurodivergent? Can you help us make sense of these things?
Sure, I can do my best. So, uh, neurodiversity is a form of human diversity like gender diversity or cultural diversity. So diversity, it's what you get when a bunch of people are different from each other. It's just, okay, there's a range of there's a range of variations here, right? With culture, with gender, with ethnicity, with body size, height, eye color, all of these things. Humans are highly diverse in many ways, and humans are neurodiverse as well. Um, so neurodiversity is the diversity among humans in terms of neurocognitive styles. In other words, how our minds function. When we talk about uh, neurodiversity, that neuro is interesting, that prefix neuro, because a lot of people have approached it in a reductionist way and talked about it as a variety among human brains. But neuro doesn't mean brain. Neuro means nerve. And the brain is part of a very extensive nervous system which connects which is the brain is part of the nervous system. It's central to it, but then the nervous system also connects to the entire body. And so there's an entire body system, right? And uh, in addition to, you know, the brain being a control center for the actions of the actions of the body and the way we embody ourselves in the world also shape the brain. And so there's this mutual pattern of development. Consciousness, we're increasingly learning, cognition is embodied. And so really we're talking with neurodiversity about the diversity among body minds and how body minds function and how human cognition functions. Um, everyone, every single human being ever is part of the spectrum of human neurodiversity by definition. Nobody's outside of that, just like nobody's outside of the spectrum of human cultural diversity. And people get confused on this point because neoliberal corporate speak has started using the term diversity as a euphemism, and using diverse as a euphemism so they don't have to say historically marginalized and oppressed. So, but that's not what diverse means. Diverse, uh, uh, we're just humans are just diverse, and nobody is outside of the spectrum of cultural diversity. Nobody is outside of the spectrum of neurodiversity. It encompasses everyone. Then there's this other term, neurodivergence. Neurodivergence was coined by my friend Cassiana Asasumas back around 1999 when she was still a teenage autistic activist. And neurodivergence is any significant divergence from the dominant neurocognitive norms. So, with most forms of human diversity, societies and cultures establish norms, right? We see this played out continually, right? We see it played out in colonialism when particular cultures try to dominate other cultures and impose their cultural and social norms. We see this around gender in a big way right now, where there's particular gender norms that a lot of people want to impose on everybody. So similarly, we have a cultural tradition, we have a societal traditions of neuronormativity that say there's one correct range in which one correct way for the human body mind to function, one correct mode of cognition. This is how a mind should function. This is how information should be processed. There's one particular range of experience there that's privileged as normal. And so to be outside of that is to be neurodivergent. Now, the term neurodivergence gets misused because people often use it only to refer to a small group of neurocognitive variations that are largely, that are innate in sort of genetic developmental phenomena like autism, like ADHD, like dyslexia, but neurodivergence, as Cassiana intended when she coined the term, literally refers to any significant divergence from dominant neurocognitive norms, which means there's multiple kinds that overlap and intersect with each other. And so when we talk about autism, we're talking about an innate form of neurodivergence. We're talking about something that is largely genetic, that you're born autistic and you stay autistic, and you might develop in all sorts of different ways beyond that, but autism is your basic cognitive operating system, and that doesn't change if you're autistic. And that's the case to varying degrees for other forms of innate neurodivergence. There's also acquired neurodivergence, though. So when we're talking in terms of things that people have to be aware of in the context of, therapy and that sort of thing, PTSD is acquired neurodivergence, right? It fundamentally affects how the nervous system operates, how cognition operates, making changes in terms of levels of vigilance and salience and such. And it's acquired. Dementia also, right? That's acquired neurodivergence. And then there's a kind that often doesn't get talked about in the literature on neurodiversity. And this is something that I'm personally very focused on changing right now in my own work, because a lot of the scholarship around neurodiversity has happened in disability studies and related fields. There's a lot of focus on innate or acquired neurodivergence that is connected with disability in some way, whether we're talking about autism or dyslexia or PTSD. But remember, neurodivergence is any significant form of divergence from dominant cognitive norms. And that includes, for instance, the way that your brain changes if you have a sustained long-term meditation practice. That is neurodivergence. It also includes the way your brain changes if you do a whole lot of psychedelics. So that's something that I want us to keep in mind as we talk about psychedelics and neurodiversity and neurodivergence, is that those of us who are involved in the field of psychedelics are in the business of creating neurodivergence.
This is yeah, excellent. And I almost noticed like I switched to student mode where it's like, okay, yeah, what's next? I forget moderator. Nick,
Nick has a way of doing that.
Nick, in the same vein, it might be helpful actually, and this is something that I've run into quite often, is explaining what autism actually is, and a lot of people kind of come up, even some mental health care professionals that I know, and kind of say, well, it's primarily a lack of mirror neurons, for example, or it's the incapacity to experience something along the lines that we might call empathy. Other people might point to the problems in theory of mind. Now, I know that you've done a lot of work around this, and I think it's outside of the scope of this particular conversation to go into the details, but you actually offered a completely, I'm not sure if it's a completely new, but you offered an alternative understanding of what autism actually is. And in our preparation conversation, Alicia said, well, and your definition took off, it went viral. Can you elucidate what that definition is and why it's
Yes.
useful?
May
And
I
I
jump
will,
in with just a brief fun
oh,
anecdote here
please.
about how that
Yes.
happened? I mentioned
Yes.
that Nick was providing invaluable consultation for our pilot study of MDMA-supported therapy for social anxiety with autistic adults. And our sponsor created a web page that was intended to inspire funding and appeal, and they used all the tropes from the pathologizing paradigm about autism and was putting this out there in the world in a website that had Nick's name on it. And I had an exchange where Nick was really heated, going, I can't keep doing that. I can't work with this sponsor if they're going to keep doing this. Ah! And I just, Nick, wait, don't quit, don't go. You write your own definition. And so I know that Nick already had this work in progress, but went and revised it and put it out on the old website and kind of reclaimed the definition of autism. And we enforced that with the sponsor so they would stop taking those harmful messages down. And I think to your surprise, Nick, maybe not, maybe you saw this coming, the new definition went viral. And the next thing I know, Nick's saying, it's been translated into 10, 12, new languages around the world. So because it's so tied to our topic of psychedelics, I just wanted to throw that in there. So what was in the definition that changed things and went viral?
All right. Well, I'll give the definition in a moment. I want to say a couple of things about it. I'll give the definition as I articulate it right now, because it's evolved a little bit. But if you're curious about the old, about the original definition that I wrote up at Alicia's behest, it's on my website, neuroqueer.com. If you go to the essay section of the website, you'll see a what is autism uh, art essay, and that is the original one that went up viral and got very translated and reprinted and such. And it, uh, this is why I like this sort of panel format too, by the way, for talks and such like that, because essentially I only ever articulate anything when somebody insists on it. So it's much credit to Alicia for asking me to write that thing in the first place, because I just wouldn't have on my own. But anyway, the definition is actually it is based on extensive scientific research. So there's been a lot of garbage science around autism, but there've been some, especially over the past couple decades, there's been some really good neuroscience research on it. And so I was basing the definition on that, but the research that was being done was not catching on widely. And the researchers were doing, I think, like Markram and Markram did the early research on it, talked about autism as what they called intense world syndrome, but their language is very pathologizing still. And the language of the research studies is very pathologizing, and it's they're not drawing conclusions from it holistically about, well, what does this mean for autistic people's lives, and what we're observing, how does what we're observing connect with, neuroscientifically, how does that connect with the actual lived subjective experience of autistic people? So my definition was really about putting that together and articulating it in a straightforward, simple, non-pathologizing way. So I'll hook you up with the the definition, or I guess with my explanation of autism. So the fundamental uh, the fundamental distinguishing characteristic of autism relative to non-autistic neurocognition is there's this high density of cortical neurons, what's called the the most basic unit of neural connections in the cortex is called the mini column. And so during the early years in the womb and the early years of development, as webs of neural connection are being built that essentially our how our brains learn to map and interpret our environment and our bodies and such. Um, there's an extensive pruning process where a lot of cortical mini columns die off. With autism, that does not happen, or at least does not happen as much. And so you get a high density of cortical mini columns. And because of the high density, they're less insulated from each other. Now, what this translates as in terms of its effect on experience is less sensory and cognitive filtering. And right away here, we're tying in with the topic of psychedelics because Aldous Huxley, writing about psychedelics, in the 1950s and 60s, his famous work on that is called The Doors of Perception. And he talks from, I think, a William Blake quote originally, but he talks about the doors of perception, meaning that the way that um, we learn in starting in infancy to filter out a lot of sensory information and pay attention to the things that, the things that are actually salient and relevant based on what we learn as an infant. Like there's too much sensory information in the world for us to process all of it. And so we learn what to focus on, and uh, the gates of our perception let only a small amount of information in, and we have some very set habitual ways of processing and thinking about that information. And so Huxley was saying that psychedelics open the doors of perception. Suddenly, information is flooding in, available to us that we were previously filtering out, what we call these days outside the box thinking. So to be autistic, essentially you're born with the doors of perception flung open wider, and you don't get as much sensory filtering. The doors of perception are open to a lot more information. So you get a very intense and chaotic sensory experience as a result. Um, everything uh, everything about autism that people pathologize and try to explain in various bizarre ways with, like, theories about mirror neurons or that sort of thing, all of that can actually be traced back to this intense sensory experience, to the open doors of perception. Everything traces back to that. So um, if you look at uh, you know, if you look at diagnostic manuals like the DSM in the US, or was the World Health Organization's, what's the ICD in Europe? If you look at those diagnostic manuals and the way autism is commonly explained, it's talked about in terms of social deficits, communication deficits. But what's happening really, all of that is secondary. All of that is side effects, because what's really happening is you start with the intense sensory experience. Now, if you studied your child development, your good old Piaget, right? little babies go through this sensory motor stage of development where they're like figuring out like, oh, where does my body begin and end? You know, how do I make sense of the world around me? How do I interpret, how do I take all the flood of sensory information coming in and turn it into a coherent picture of the world and where I am in it? Well, um, at the same time, of course, babies and toddlers and are learning other things like picking up social learning very quickly. Children just soak up social learning from very early, long before they can do spoken language. Children are picking up on the rhythms of interaction in the culture and family system around them, for instance. So imagine here, okay, autistic child, a lot more sensory information coming in. What that means is they need a lot more time and a lot more of their cognitive bandwidth to do the sensory motor stage of development. It essentially never fully ends. And because of that, there's less bandwidth left over for social learning. And so the social learning process takes longer because more attention and energy is required for the sensory motor development process. And similarly, right, you know, there's all these like efforts to, figure out, well, okay, why can some autistic people uh, sort of pass for non-autistic in the world, and why can some of them just not speak, not do spoken language, not do basic tasks and stuff? Well, the answer to that is, again, sensory motor, right? If you have an extremely intense sensory experience, very intense and chaotic sensory experience, it is more difficult to keep track of where your body is, because that sensory feedback that lets us know what our body is doing and where your body is. So there were, many, many years of autistic people who couldn't speak being assumed to be, you know, uh, uh, mentally not there at all. Uh, and of course, that's changed. It started to change as more autistic people who can't speak have learned other forms of communication, like typing, text-to-speech technology, and such. But bottom line is, it's a coordination issue. You can't speak if you can't feel where your mouth is. So there's so both the autistic talents that impress so many people and the difficulties so many autistic people face, they're all traceable back to the issue of the intense and chaotic sensory experience. So that's my autism explanation as I put it these days.
Thank you very much for such an extensive, explanation and definition. It immediately provokes a lot of curiosity, and especially as we're talking about psychedelics, I'm curious if maybe Alicia, you could speak to some of the things that you have found through your research. Um, when autistic folks take psychedelic, what might happen to an autistic person that is different what you would expect from a quote unquote neurotypical person? And I do think that with the neurodiversity paradigm in the back of my mind, there's been a campaign in the Netherlands that said, "Have you ever met a normal person?" So I do want to keep that in mind, that we're never sure where we are on this vast spectrum of diverse neurotypes. But speaking in some generalities, what would you say could happen differently for an autistic person taking some of the classic psychedelics? And then maybe that can also be a bridge into the study that you both collaborated on.
I think if we start from the premise that there are infinitely many ways to be autistic and expressions of autism, I'm only going to speak in broad generalities. And going way back to my bottom-up thinker dissertation research where I just had to gather so many data points and then see how themes sort of constellated. In my first presentations, when I first started speaking publicly about autism and psychedelics, it was focused on MDMA, so we'll consider that an atypical psychedelic. The themes that emerged, I referred to as the 5 Cs. And interestingly, in the past couple of years, I realized, oh my goodness, these coincide precisely with the 8 Cs of internal family systems. I wasn't aware of internal family systems, so I don't think it's any coincidence that IFS has been such a compatible pairing with psychedelics. But the themes I saw were the ones that you would expect to see with, an allistic population or non-autistic population taking MBC. Improved communication, heightened sense of connectedness, communion, courage to try new things. But the one that stood out as being very different than reports I'd heard prior, when autistic people reported about their MDMA experiences, I called clarity. And the kinds of reports I heard sounded, I'm paraphrasing some of the little snippets of interview dialogue, was for the first time in my life, my thoughts straightened out in a straight line, or the chaos in my head quieted down, or I could hear myself think clearly for the first time. People talk about heightened insights and so on with MDMA generally, but there was something qualitatively a little bit different about a sense of clarity and calm that was a common theme, not universal, but that stood out as something a little different is happening for this group of people. And it was around that peace in the mind, a sense of calm and being at home, as if that sensory onslaught, it was like a gridlock and a traffic jam of the poor, thalamus and other sensory traffic cops in the brain could just take a break and things could just sort of flow where they went. And then that was borne out in the pilot study. In the clinical trial, it was especially apparent for the people who were randomized first to the inactive placebo. So we had a sense of what it was like to go through a course of DBT-informed core mindfulness therapy and sitting all day long into placebo sessions. When they came back for open label MDMA, Dr. Charles and Grobe and I facilitated all the sessions. We had the experience of observing this same person in that state of calm. And they reported it to us directly. I've never felt like this. I feel peaceful. I feel calm. I don't feel afraid. And we know with MDMA, you get that reduction in amygdala, or especially left amygdala activation, that threat center kind of quiets down. And what was astonishing was with that calm, with that sense of peace and all rightness, with the sensory world, an ability to be social in a new way just emerged organically. Skills that that none of our participants had previously had an opportunity to just engage in. These aptitudes to be calm in the body and engage with us in social ways that were previously inaccessible to them were just suddenly available for a window of time without any prompting or encouraging from us and how it should be. We always followed their lead. And it was just amazing to us to think, how are you engaging with this in this way if you've never had an opportunity to practice it before? And I think the answer, maybe this is too much of a leap, but I think the answer would be something like, I've never had a break in the sensory the work I've had to do to process everything coming in through my 5 apparent senses and kind of the 3 hidden ones, and how that translated after the study, after somebody kind of comes back to their baseline presets, where it was helpful is at least now I have a marker of what it's like to be in that other state. And some people can use that as a point of reference in ways that are helpful for them. If you'd like me to make that a bit more concrete and tangible, an example from an interview was somebody who spontaneously, without any prep or anything, just decided to take ecstasy at a club. And someone where they were with said you might actually enjoy sustained eye contact in this state. You might want to just try it. They were with a friend and they both sort of turned to each other and really enjoyed the experience of being absorbed in prolonged eye contact. It didn't bring up distress. And they sort of joked about it. Oh, at the end of the night, I went back to my baseline. But the following week, by chance, they had a job interview scheduled. And all the social anxiety started coming back in. And they said, wait a minute, I'm capable of engaging in a certain way because I did it on Saturday night at that club. And they used that brief awareness of certain aptitudes, not to change themselves or address some sort of pathology, but that point of reference was helpful for them as something that they is a way to operate if they chose for a period of time. And they found that helpful, and that's not the experience everyone has, but it's a theme that recurred. I hope I explained that clearly.
Thank you. I'm curious if you've because I think both of you speak to so many people. Both of you are quite deeply embedded also in the field of psychedelic care and psychedelics at large. Have you heard a lot of autistic folks share some of their experiences with you that in terms of pattern recognition might have elucidated a sense of, oh, it seems as if some folks on the autistic spectrum are actually experiencing LSD in a different way than many of the neurotypicals, and I'm curious if you could speak to some of those things. Um, yeah.
Well, excuse me, I will say LSD experiences are very widely varied among everyone anyway. But uh, there is definitely a couple of patterns I've observed with autistic people using LSD, is really enjoying it as a bonding drug, as a social bonding experience, because often autistic people have, there's that cycle where their social development is slowed down by the need to, put so much energy into sensory motor tasks in the early years. And so they fall behind their peers socially in terms of like connecting with non-autistic peers is difficult for them in early childhood because they got a later start on it. And so they experience social rejection. So they don't have as many positive social experiences. And it sort of mounts up. They accumulate the sense of social anxiety and isolation over time. And so yeah, psychedelics in general, certainly MDMA, but LSD too, becomes a break in that pattern. And so the pleasures of interpersonal bonding, free of the baggage of a lifetime of difficult social experiences, is a common thread. Um, that I've seen. And also, um, again, uh, with LSD, psilocybin, with a lot of the classic psychedelics, there is that opening of the doors of perception, right? There is that, like, suddenly, wow, you're seeing auras and trails and everything is moving and breathing. And there's, synesthesia and all of that. I mean, to some extent, it's duplicating an autistic sensory experience for a non-autistic people, because autistic people are already accustomed to intense sensory experience. I found that autistic people taking psychedelics are less caught up in the sensory aspects of it and more focused on the cognitive aspects of it, on like uh sort of connecting with the archetypal, doing the Jungian kind of archetypal work with psychedelics, doing the, like, enjoying the insights and weird pattern recognitions and strange inside jokes and stuff that emerge on psychedelics. The cognitive experience of it and the insight and the exploration of unconscious material comes to the forefront more easily, because the sensory effects are fun, but they're not as distracting for autistic people because we're always immersed in sensory distraction. Um, and I'll say my own experience with psychedelics started totally recreationally, hanging out, um, hanging out as a teenager, with just all the druggy metalheads in my school, because I mean, metalheads are great. They like sensory intensity, and they totally get it if you're rocking back and forth. So that was my friend circle in my teens. Um, and that was a scene where people were very into acid, and LSD was an amazing social bonding and social development experience for me, having had the usual autistic social difficulties and social isolation up until then. And uh, part of it was that I found that acid was a level playing field. That I wasn't me trying to figure out a way into the world of non-autistic people. We were all going into a world together that was completely bizarre to us, and we were all equally out of our depth. And I had this experience also of, it was my whole life from infancy navigating wild sensory experiences. I mean, I see auras and things all of the time. That's just my ordinary sensory experience. Intense synesthesia is my ordinary everyday sensory experience. So the result was, I could navigate the social world more easily on acid than non-autistic people, because I was less distracted by that. So the particularly hilarious thing is, if we had to deal with cops or other adult authority figures, I was the one who could speak coherently and act like I wasn't on acid. So it's like, okay, this is a very different world here, where suddenly you want the autistic person handling the social stuff. So that was a powerful growth experience for me.
Thank you. I recognize a lot, so I'm smiling. Sorry, Alicia, go ahead.
Two things, just building on the great foundation Nick just laid out there. I'm going to springboard into two things I've kind of observed, maybe a bit more on the clinical side. Two things. Reports, some in clinical settings, official data, some just anecdotal or just being around and listening, some kind of being aware of some of the subjective stuff coming out of the grassroots autism organizations around psychedelics. One pattern I've recognized, and this again, not universal. Oftentimes autistic people will speak about MDMA in a way non-autistic people do, but more commonly they'll go, yeah, MDMA was great. I'm glad I tried it, but it was kind of fake. It was kind of chemical. It wasn't real love. I think that autistic preference in general for authenticity, that literalism bias, is that real? Is that real? Whereas with LSD and the tryptamines and the more classic psychedelics, the word that I hear more commonly is it's more spiritual. That's their word, not mine. It was more spiritual. There's more depth to it. It was more real as opposed to something chemically induced. I don't know what to make of that, but it's just something I've observed, that distinction, that MDMA, that was fine, but it wasn't real. Kind of like the analogy of that was training wheels to help me ride a bicycle. But LSD is more like, you know, zooming down the highway on a motorcycle somehow. I don't know, odd metaphor. But the other thing, that building on one of Nick's early points about this interconnectedness and the social aspects of LSD, clinically, one thing I've observed is it can also profoundly shift the relationship to the self. And to make that more tangible, what that might look like, I am often humbled by my limitations as a clinician if I come against those situations where I need to refer to somebody with specialty training. For example, uh, body dysmorphic disorder. If my competency as a clinician cannot help, that's beyond, and I try the standard of care, I work with somebody for a long time and it's not busting through. I've observed some individuals, some who've left my care, approach me, go, I did LSD, and this challenge I was having about accepting and loving myself, or if you think about some of the neuroscience about differences in the insular cortex that help with neurodiversity of different types, sometimes the part of the brain that is kind of credited with helping get that cohesive sense of I am me, I am a self. Sometimes there's just this breakthrough moment that busts through the rumination, busts through the impulsivity, busts through the challenges with attention, and that moment of clarity comes, and that self-acceptance. I don't know why I've hung on to this belief for so long. Sometimes I almost laugh about, like, that isn't true. I'm not as horrible as I believed myself to be. In fact, I am lovable. I'm worthy of love. I like myself in a different way. So I've seen that with both MDMA and the classic psychedelics, as they can be profoundly helpful for removing some of the barriers to having that cohesive sense of self and actually loving and accepting that self.
Thank you. And this kind of leads to, and there's a few questions coming in. So I'm going to try to, also for the people that are asking these questions, I'm going to try to synergize some of them. Because what I hear you speak to, Alicia, is that autistic folks can really benefit from psychedelics. And one thing that I think is important to note here is that these trials are not designed to treat autism by definition, because we do not consider autism a thing that should be treated. It's a natural variation. That does not negate.
It would be a fool's errand.
Exactly. But it does not negate that there's a lot of people that do struggle with mental health problems, also autistic folks. And so there's sort of two questions is, what could psychedelics provide to autistic folks in terms of improvements for their mental health? How would a treatment with a psychedelic for an autistic person look like? And additionally, Johannes Rohr, I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asks, is it true that autism is typically an exclusion criteria in psychedelic trials? at the same time, there seems to be very few trials targeting autistic people. I think your research is actually one of the few that has been done. So could you speak to these two questions? Like, what is the potential of psychedelics for mental health in autistic adults? And how does that work? Like, do we actually have the research? Are we not excluding people that could really benefit?
One point I think it's really essential to make is to be very careful about how we speak about what psychedelics can do for autistic people in absolutes. There was a qualitative study published, with collaboration from one of these big grassroots groups that focus on psychedelics, and I think they reported the kind of typical glowing, like 80% of the people reported that it was a very positive, life affirming, but about 20% rated it as like is harmful. So I don't want to lose sight of that not insignificant percentage of people who have a bad, terrifying experience that may require its own mental health support as potentially even a source of trauma or something very destabilizing. So I think it's really important that we approach it from that perspective. As you already alluded to, the potential comes from supporting other challenges that autistic populations may just be more vulnerable to experience or are prevalent in those populations. The ones that are most commonly cited are depression and anxiety, including social anxiety. Let's see. I'm going to collect my thoughts a bit, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Nick, but do you want to
Yeah,
jump
I have,
in
I
and,
have, I have, I have thoughts.
yeah, I no.
Yeah, go sure. Okay, so um, people have mental health needs, humans just do. I mean, it's hard being human, and uh humans have managed I mean evolution works slowly. So we evolved for most of our existence as humans. Humans were hunter-gatherers, and so we're kind of still operating with hunter-gatherer body mind. So we've managed to build a very non-hunter-gatherer world, and a world, and societies, especially the more capitalistic ones, that create a great deal of alienation and isolation, and actively, you know, uh, violate the human need for community and connection. And so everybody's a mess these days. Human mental health is a disaster area right now, because we have managed to be a clever enough species to create a society that we can't actually live in. So, so yeah, there's just a massive human mental health crisis in general, and you try to have, conversations with people on the internet or even in person these days, and becomes, or teach people in classrooms or to be a therapist, it becomes very clear very quickly. Most people can't even think clearly because they're so overwhelmed all of the time. And so, uh, uh, you know, so deprived in terms of the basic human needs for connection and creativity, community, integration time. We've created a world that's killing us. So this is universal human issues, and autistic people experience this as well, and sometimes more than other people. Sometimes autistic people are the canaries in the coal mine, um, because as the world gets noisier and allows for less integration time and less time to connect and such like that, the people who need more processing time feel it the first and the hardest. Plus the fact that autistic people are just treated badly in the society, stigmatized and discriminated against. So we have we have a difficulty understanding what autism is because you haven't seen autism. All you've seen is autism plus trauma. And most people have no, including most autistic people, have no idea what a non-traumatized autistic person looks like. And you see even people like Temple Grandin, who's a very, whose work in autism is widely read. I mean, you read about Grandin's childhood, and it's like, oh my God, what a nightmare of trauma her mother subjected her to. And the um, and she talks about, you know, anxiety as being inherent to autism because she doesn't have the experience of being free of anxiety. And so, you know, uh, people mistake the anxiety and trauma experienced by autistic people for a so-called symptom of autism or an autistic trait. It's not. It's part of it is just, almost every human these days is a wreck, and autistic people are being often hit harder by it. And part of it is how autistic people are routinely traumatized and taught that they should be anxious. They're taught this is what it means to be autistic. Now, speaking as an autistic person who started out that way, who had a very traumatic childhood experience, and having done decades of intensive work, somatically, spiritually healing and developing myself, I I pretty much healed from my trauma. I feel great basically all of the time. And um, as as an Aikido teacher, which is something I've been doing much longer than anything else I've done in my life, I I um, I work primarily with non-autistic students and am just struck at how, okay, wow, people come in and they're a mess. People come in not knowing how to relax and not knowing how to feel their bodies and feel what they're feeling and think clearly. And um, all of the things that people say about autistic people and how much difficulty they have just seems to be true of all the non-autistic people who I meet when I actually start teaching them and trying to help them and such. So uh, my point being, um, distress, mental distress is widespread and not intrinsic to Aikido, or not, sorry, not intrinsic to autism any more than it's intrinsic to, any other style of neurocognitive functioning. Um, and that means it's treatable. And so the question then becomes, how do we treat it in people in general, psychedelics being an increasingly popular answer, an increasingly popular part of the solution for treating human distress. And with autistic people, psychedelics, I think, can be especially helpful in that regard if handled well, because conventional therapies are often designed with non-autistic cognition in mind. And so common things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, frequently don't work for autistic people because they're designed with a particular kind of mind in mind. And it's just, I mean, I've tried CBT in the past, and I've studied CBT extensively as a psychology professor. It just seems like nonsense to me. And I know it's helped many people, but from an autistic perspective, it's like, this has nothing to do with how my mind works. This has nothing to do with how my cognitive process works. This assumes all kinds of absurd things like that I think in language, for instance. Um, and it's just not, it's not relevant. And so how do you treat autistic people, plus the fact that we get subjected to so much gaslighting often inadvertent by people who just don't understand how our minds function, um, we can't necessarily, like a therapist can tell us very little about how our minds work, right? And so we need a tool that helps us with self-insight more. And so here goes psychedelics. They're going to work with whatever our cognitive process is, and they're going to provide self-insight, and healthy therapeutic guidance is really good to have to help with integration. But psychedelics bypass the whole issue of, uh, you know, therapists not understanding how our minds work. So I think that they're particularly useful from that perspective, because they kind of, in a built-in inherent way, provide an opportunity for insight that is tailored to our minds. The psychedelic will interact with us as who we are in a way that a human therapist might not.
Yeah. You just said something so key, and thanks for filling it. And I so appreciate the piece my mind was grasping for that you latched right onto was the influence of ableism and how pervasive trauma is. So I really do hope that the research on psychedelics and PTSD can continue, because I don't know. I'd be hard pressed to name autistic people I know who have not experienced trauma, and the trauma of going out the front door when you summon the courage to do that and encountering a world that tells you you're not doing it right. um it reminds me the other day somebody told me about a meme I think they encountered somewhere online of a little autistic little one who was trying to use the term neurotypical, and they said neurodifficult, which so that's my new term. I said, oh, those neurodifficult people, which reminded me of a point that I just made a few notes on a piece of paper before this talk. And one thing I wanted to make sure that I said that dovetails nicely with your last thought. And it was one thing that's going to be essential if we talk about psychedelic therapies and clinical research and bringing, autistic people into those settings, is how essential it's going to be to have facilitators and therapists and service providers who are either autistic or related neurodivergent themselves, or who are autistic informed, who have learned about autism from autistic researchers and individuals and colleagues and acquaintances. I think that's essential as an element of set and setting. Um, to have people who understand autism in the room, um, just in terms of setting up settings where treatment takes place, based on consultation with Nick and others. When we set up our treatment room for the social anxiety study, I would go in it was just bare bones, nothing in the room. And I would just lay on the floor, absorbing everything coming in through my senses about that setting. And then I set about designing the room to offset intrusive sensory input. How do we control the lights with the right kinds of blinds? How do we take the tubes out of those fluorescent lights and bring in warm, soft lighting? What do we do to mitigate all the things that could be intrusive from a sensory perspective? Our big budget splurge was this really comfortable motorized electronic recliner. Just thinking about every little sensory detail of it. Does it squeak when you move? Does it smell funny? What if you should perspire? Are you going to worry? Are you going to become socially self-conscious that fabric will get damp? Is it easy to clean? All those things. You've really got to start there to make the setting autistic informed and sensory friendly, or the whole thing probably isn't gonna fly. And then building, maybe if I can segue to sort of expand the conversation, I think I'm still on topic from your original prompts, but it's just some of the clinical considerations in research and in therapy settings. Like the question people ask me, well, what's different for autistic people? I just have a couple bullet points about some of the things I elaborate on in a chapter I just submitted for a textbook that Nick is one of the co-editors. So this is kind of top of mind and fresh. But people providing psychedelic supports for autistic individuals would be well advised, I think, to keep in mind the literalism bias that's common. I was taught erroneously that autistic people cannot grasp figurative language, never speak in metaphors or analogies. That got wiped away, but the fact that most of the autistic people I work with appreciate a literal say what you mean and mean what you say form of communication. So some of the, hope I'm not offending anybody because I have one foot in this camp, but some of the kind of woo-woo, language people use in speaking about psychedelics, I encourage everybody to just be very direct and straightforward and really say what you mean when you're helping people prepare for these experiences or helping them integrate. And then other considerations are just knowing some of the traits that are more prevalent in autistic populations that aren't always necessarily readily apparent, like aphantasia or a lack or less mental imagery, visual imagery conjured up spontaneously, and understanding with aphantasia, there's broad variability. For example, you might say to someone, imagine an apple, and there might be just a blank, nothing happens. There might be only memories of actual apples someone has seen in real life on one end, and on the other end, some human minds can conjure up an entirely imaginal apple that they just created out of their understanding of apple. So being careful to not overemphasize or not make assumptions about in psychedelics, mental imagery is often really emphasized. Don't make assumptions about what's going on in someone else's mind and talking about you will see this. Really learning about their capacity to envision images in their mind's eye. Similarly, alexithymia or challenges with recognizing and identifying sensations in one's own body and communicating that to someone else, getting a good understanding and maybe even using a screening survey to get a sense of the extent to which someone experiences alexithymia and in which domains they may find it difficult. And in my limited experience, I found that working with MDMA was actually effective for people who wanted to address the alexithymia and build skills at recognizing, oh, that's what that feeling in my body means, and here's how to put words to it and convey it to others. Don't make an assumption that every autistic person you work with in a psychedelic setting wants this, but take some steps to find out because it can be very helpful. Also taking some steps to help reduce vulnerability to meltdowns and shutdowns. Often the social anxiety is tied to this fear of becoming dysregulated, behaving in a way that provokes some social condemnation or disapproval from others, helping build some of those skills to recognize when they may need a sensory break or access to means to self-soothe. In our treatment setting, we really normalized things like if you need to lie flat on your back on the floor, do that. If you need to pace, do that. at one point in the session, I was invited to partner dance. And it took a moment, like, am I allowed to do this? And it turned out that yes, clinically the response was yes, let's do like the junior high shuffle and move and dance and engage in that way. Um, so really taking a thorough assessment before providing any psychedelic support or facilitation of what someone might need. We had one research participant ask me very directly, what if I need to hide? Because we're in a small room with two people the whole day. And our answer was, let's build a fort under the desk with a blanket partition and bolsters and pillows and comfort items. And if you need to go under that desk at any point, what if you're having difficulty articulating that verbally? So we came up with a hand sign that would tell us time to retreat to the little chill space under the desk. They didn't need to use it, but just knowing it was there, that intervention accomplished it. And then one last thing I'll just add, because I'm aware of the time and I don't want to forget to mention this one, because it's become a bit of a soapbox issue for me and something I think it's important for the psychedelics community to acknowledge more broadly. Across clinical trials, there have been, discussions that have not really made its way to the published literature to the extent that I really wish it would. And that's with MDMA in particular. I'm not familiar with the extent to which this happens with other substances. There is a classic non-responder response where a not insignificant percentage of people who take MDMA at the standard dose, where you would anticipate an elevation in body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, they get neither the physiological nor the subjective effects. And what you might hear is like, well, it kind of feels like I had a cup of coffee. And that's a very important clinical consideration because of all the hype around psychedelics. If people arrive anticipating, oh, I'm one of the lucky ones who's getting the miracle treatment, and they have this classic non-responder experience, that can be a vulnerability and a risk factor in and of its own. One of the colleagues attached to our study then collaborated with some other folks to look at this question. Is it an issue of rapid metabolism or genetic things going on with the liver that just kind of clears the drug out of the system rapidly? But what looks more likely is a prior history of SSRI use and how long they were on it, how long, and the dose, and how long it had been since they tapered, if they tapered off before MDMA. So the research is still emerging on that. But it's probably obvious I could talk about this all day long without taking a breath, so I'll pause here. I just wanted to get some of this clinical stuff in.
I want to jump in here and say everything Alicia just said is great, 100% endorse, and all of it is applicable to therapy and research with non-autistic people on psychedelics. And that is a point that I want to make here. One, that autistic experience around a lot of these things is human experience and not as different and separate from the rest of human experience as it's sometimes presented. But two, also because it's more, the need for this sort of stuff is more pronounced with autistic people. I will say to therapists and other professionals in the audience, especially, if you learn to communicate well with autistic people, it will make you better at communicating with everyone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
I couldn't agree more either. There's something about, yeah. maybe a final question, and thank you both for taking so much time to help us. Alicia, thank you for keeping track of time. I'm time blind as time blind as they come, and I could go on for hours as well.
I don't know if we have a hard out or
I think we're gonna slowly move towards wrapping up.
Yeah, we started a little late, so it's
We
okay.
started a little late, so we can go a little over. Maybe
If
maybe
anybody does need to leave, though, we won't feel hurt and abandoned or anything. We won't take it personally.
I do have a little update about some of the research that's continuing if you want to leave a little time for that.
I would love to hear that. And yeah, if you can, yes, and because it ties into something that we discussed very briefly in our opening conversation, that after the FDA decision to kind of like not move ahead with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD as it currently has been offered to the FDA, there seems to be a renewed interest in some of the studies of MDMA with autism, and so I'm curious. Yeah.
Yeah. At a certain point after the two big psilocybin for anxiety reactive to cancer, life-threatening illness was published, there was a real sea change and a shift, and it became very difficult for me to continue working in psychedelic research because I felt as if like snapping piranhas were coming out of the woodwork trying to get me to endorse their commercial ventures around psychedelics. Will you be on our scientific advisory board? People throwing money at me, and just the drive to make a profit off of this work just went haywire at a certain point. It was really difficult to field everything that was coming at me. So I kind of retreated for a while. But I'm starting to feel some of that start up again now that the progression that everyone was kind of banking on for MDMA to be approved as a prescription with therapy for treatment of PTSD. Now that that train is kind of stopped, there are a lot of interests out there that are thinking, uh-oh, I'll speak very bluntly, how else can we make fortunes off of the corporatization of psychedelics? And so there's been a shift because our little pilot study is one of the few or the only other phase 2 for a specific treatment indication. And so a lot of eyes that are going, oops, PTSD, we're blocked. Can we open up this autism thing? And in the same vein that got Nick so riled up about there's a faction out there that's like, oh, we can market this MDMA thing as a treatment for this autism epidemic, and kind of using those scare tactics, and it's revving up again. I don't think they're going to get very far, but it's just important to be aware that it's happening. And that said, there are some viable research projects in various phases of startup. Some of them are recruiting. In Australia, there's a phase 3 MDMA social anxiety study for young adults. I question myself, how young is young? Because the issue of working with minors has been a hot button issue for me. And they're approved, I think, to work with 16 to 25-year-olds, but they're really not anticipating getting anybody 16 and 17. They're really expecting to work with 18 to 25-year-olds, which is well within my comfort zone based on what I've seen in research settings. In the UK, there's a psilocybin study going on with autistic and non-autistic participants. I think they're in startup or recruiting. And in Canada, there's a study to measure mechanisms of treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin in autistic populations. So there's some research bubbling up, and I anticipate in a kind of slow and steady fashion the research will continue and we'll have more data and even more opportunities for even more robust discussions in the coming years from a research perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe as a closing question, many people might be very inspired and really want to take to heart what both of you have been offering, but would not consider themselves autistically informed or informed about autism in a way that is in line with what we've been talking about tonight. Where can people start? How do people become neuro-inclusive? How do people become well-informed about autism? What textbook can they read? And maybe the other question, when can they read the textbook that you both just referenced?
Well,
Do we have another hour?
I mean, why not? I'm going to say start by reading my book. It is, yeah, read my book, Neuroqueer Heresies, because it is a good place to start just in terms of basic concepts, making sure that ethically you're in the right place, that your conceptions, you're kind of neurodiversity informed, and your conceptions of autism are not harmful. So I would say, yeah, I would say start there. My book is a good starting point. A lot of good stuff. The work of Dr. Damian Milton is good. He's put out some stuff, edited some anthologies. He writes a lot about what he calls the double empathy problem, which is how there's this popular misconception of autistic people lacking empathy, because when an autistic person uh, has trouble understanding a non-autistic person, it gets blamed on the autistic person. And when a non-autistic person has trouble understanding an autistic person, it also gets blamed on the autistic person. So lot of work like that. Good stuff out there. Uh, uh, and then just depends on what specific things you want to focus on. My colleague Remy Yurgo's book, Authoring Autism, is a really good in-depth critique of pathologizing attitudes toward autistic people if you really want to do a deep dive. Yeah, there's good stuff. There's good books. There's a lovely book called Autistic World Domination by Jolene Stockman in New Zealand. Which is more for autistic people. It's something that I recommend to autistic clients, just about autistic self-empowerment. So a lot of good stuff like that out there right now. The anthology that Alicia mentioned, that I'm co-editing with my colleague Andrew Reichart, will be out. Probably, I'm guessing, I mean, publication schedules are always weird, but I'm guessing late 2026 or early 2027 from W.W. Norton. And it's just going to be called like Neurodiversity and Psychotherapy or something like that. But that'll be, yeah, it'll be around eventually. And meanwhile, there's definitely a wealth of material available right now. One of the links that has shown up in the chat here is I think I'll drop it in again, in fact, just so everyone catches it, is the Therapist Neurodiversity Collective, which offers education on the neurodiversity paradigm for therapists and also therapist directories. Yeah.
Keeping it simple, the only thing I'd add to that is if you're brand new and you're sort of approaching this fresh for the first time, just do a search, autistic authors, and read both fiction and nonfiction by autistic authors. Somebody told me one time the smartest move I ever made as a psychologist was deciding to be a literature major as an undergraduate, because that's where you really learn about the psyche. And some research supports the case that reading, immersion in fiction for people for whom that's accessible can be a real empathy builder. So, search out work, both clinical education materials, scholarly academic papers, work by autistic researchers, and immerse yourself in the writings and teachings of autistic individuals.
Alicia, Nick, thank you so much. It feels like we're only kind of like touching on the surface. I want to apologize for many of the people that have asked some excellent questions that we did not get around to.
The fun part.
The fun part, we asked some of the audience questions, but not all of them.
Well, let's hang on to them for our next presentation here.
That's music to my ears, Nick. Yes.
It'll be a
Yes.
celebration for your book launch.
We would love to invite both of you back, and maybe the book launch is a beautiful moment if you're going to do a tour.
Oh, don't wait that long.
Nick, is the bachelor degree that you're designing or have designed, is it accessible to everyone?
I mean, you have to enroll at California Institute of Integral Studies, but yeah, anybody, and it's a bachelor completion program, so people have to have some general education requirements met. But yeah, I would encourage folk. Hang on, if I give me just a moment, I can put a link in the chat here. Let me just dig up a link for information on this program. Let's see. There we go. Yeah, there's a link to information on the program in the chat. But yeah, anybody who wants to complete their bachelor degree or get another one is welcome.
Thank you very, very much. Alicia, any final places you want to point people?
I'm just really immersed in the launch of our study tomorrow. After years of delays because of COVID, and the advisory panel that approves research in California put a hold on approving any research with Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 substances for a year, and we just persevered. We're doing the first medication session tomorrow for the palliative study. So I'm back in the psilocybin world, and we'll be immersed in that for a while, but we'll pop up with a publication at some point. So nothing to promote or no links to post, just working away behind the scenes.
Alicia, Nick, thank you so much for your time and for your very, very eloquent ways of introducing us to this important topic. Thank you
so much for having us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye, everyone.